I never imagined that an ordinary afternoon and a simple knock on my door would quietly awaken parts of me I thought time and routine had permanently tucked away. Before we begin, comment your city below and subscribe for more real, reflective stories that explore quiet moments, emotional depth, and life's unexpected awakenings. I never expected that the day my husband's fitness trainer came by our house would mark the beginning of a subtle but lasting shift inside me. Nothing inappropriate happened, nothing dramatic unfolded, yet the way he looked at me stirred something I had forgotten existed. It wasn't desire or temptation, it was recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that reminded me I was still a person beyond routines, responsibilities, and familiar roles. That moment opened a door I didn't know had been closed for years. I had been standing at the sink, rinsing dishes, letting the familiar rhythm of the day carry me along when the doorbell chimed softly. My husband had chosen that sound years ago, convinced it made our home feel warm and inviting. I dried my hands, assuming it might be a delivery or perhaps a neighbor. My husband was out running errands, and afternoons like this were usually uneventful. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see Mark standing there. He was my husband's longtime trainer, someone I had seen countless times in passing, but had never truly spoken to. He seemed momentarily caught off guard to see me instead of my husband, and we both shared a small, polite laugh. Mark wasn't the kind of man who demanded attention. He wasn't flashy or loud. There was a steadiness to him, a calm presence that made people feel at ease. He explained that he had stopped by to drop off an updated training schedule they had been working on together. As he handed me the papers, I noticed how he waited patiently, making sure I understood what he was explaining instead of rushing through the moment. It struck me how rare that kind of attentiveness had become. The air outside had grown cool, and without overthinking it, I invited him inside for a moment. He stepped into the foyer, glancing around with gentle curiosity, noticing the framed family photos lining the hallway. Years of memories stared back at us, smiles frozen in time, carrying both joy and quiet history. We exchanged simple conversation at first, discussing the weather, my husband's progress, and daily schedules. It all felt ordinary until something shifted almost imperceptibly. His tone softened, his attention became more focused, and he looked at me fully without distraction. I felt myself straighten unconsciously, as though my body remembered a version of me I had stopped acknowledging. It had been so long since someone looked at me without seeing me only as a wife, a caretaker, or a background presence in a busy life. He asked how I had been doing lately, not out of politeness, but with genuine curiosity. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated before answering honestly, mentioning how busy life had become and how quietly the years had moved, especially now that I was in my late 40s. He listened intently, nodding, offering nothing but presence. That alone made something inside me tighten in a deeply human way. When he finally prepared to leave, he paused at the door and gave me a thoughtful look that lingered just long enough to stay with me. As I watched him walk away, I realized the moment wasn't about him at all. It was about me and the awareness that something inside me had begun to wake up. The following day, I noticed how easily my thoughts drifted back to that brief exchange, replaying it the way one replays a familiar melody that carries feeling without drama. I kept telling myself it had been nothing more than a polite visit, an ordinary interaction layered onto an otherwise routine afternoon. Still, every time I passed through the foyer, I remembered the way he paused before leaving, as if the conversation had meant something to him too. That awareness stayed with me longer than I expected. Asterisk when my husband came home that evening. He was his usual self, relaxed but tired, talking casually about traffic and errands as he unpacked groceries onto the counter. I listened attentively, smiling at the comfortable rhythm we had built over the years. Our marriage was steady, familiar, and rooted in shared history. There was nothing missing, yet something inside me felt newly alert. At dinner, I mentioned that Mark had stopped by to deliver the updated training schedule. My husband barely reacted, simply nodding with appreciation for his trainer's dedication. He asked nothing further, and I offered nothing more. There was no way to explain what the moment had meant without making it sound larger than it was, so I let it rest. That night. After the house settled into silence, I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet hum of the world outside. I thought about how easily years slip by when life is full of responsibilities, how personal awareness can fade without ever announcing its departure. The next morning, I woke before dawn and stood by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching light slowly spread across the yard. It felt like standing at the edge of something subtle but meaningful, though I couldn't yet name it. Later that morning, I found myself cleaning the guest room. Not because it needed attention, but because I wanted to bring light into the space. I opened the curtains wide and let the sunlight spill across the bedspread. As dust motes floated through the air, I felt an unexpected sense of renewal. My thoughts drifted again, not toward Mark as a person, but toward the way he listened. It reminded me of a time when conversations felt richer, when people paused long enough to truly hear one another. That realization stayed with me, gentle but persistent. In the afternoon. My phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. It was Mark, thanking me for letting him step inside the day before and apologizing if his visit had been inconvenient. His message was respectful and professional, nothing out of place. Still, reading it caused a small, surprising lift in my chest. I replied politely, keeping my words brief, then set the phone aside, aware not of the message itself, but of how alert it made me feel. The rest of the day unfolded quietly. My husband and I cooked dinner together, shared small laughs, and settled into our evening routine. Yet beneath it all, I sensed something shifting gently inside me, not pulling me away from my life, but inviting me to look more closely at who I had become. Within it, the following week arrived with an unexpected adjustment to our routine when my husband mentioned he had scheduled a couple of training sessions at home instead of the gym. He sounded pleased, explaining that Mark had suggested trying a new program that required more space and fewer distractions. I nodded casually, keeping my reaction measured, though a quiet tightening formed in my stomach, not from worry or guilt, but from anticipation of something undefined. When the day came, I noticed myself moving through the house with unusual awareness, straightening cushions, adjusting the curtains, opening a window to let fresh air circulate. I told myself it was simply preparation, nothing more, yet I recognized the care I was taking with each small detail. When the doorbell rang and I opened it, the air shifted again in that same subtle way I had felt before. Mark stood there with a calm smile, respectful and unassuming, greeting me warmly before stepping inside. There was nothing improper in his manner, only that same steady attentiveness that made the space feel quieter and more present. As he waited for my husband to join him, I set glasses of water on the counter, moving more slowly than usual, listening to the sound of their voices as the session began. Mark's instructions were calm and measured, my husband's responses familiar and lighthearted. Everything felt normal, yet beneath it flowed a gentle current of awareness I couldn't ignore. When I passed the doorway, Mark glanced up briefly, offering a soft acknowledgement that made me feel seen without demanding anything in return. After the workout, my husband went to shower, leaving Mark and me alone in the living room. The room held a comfortable stillness, the kind that follows effort and focus. He thanked me again for letting them use the space, and I responded honestly, telling him I was glad my husband was taking care of his health. As we spoke, he asked how my week had been, and to my surprise, I answered truthfully. I spoke about reorganizing the guest room, about noticing how the light changed during the afternoons, about old interests quietly resurfacing. He listened without interruption, nodding with thoughtful ease. He remarked gently that sometimes in life, the things we set aside don't disappear. They simply wait until we're ready to notice them again. The words settled deeply, not because they were profound, but because they felt accurate. When my husband returned, joking about sore muscles, the moment folded itself neatly back into ordinary life. Yet after Mark left, the house felt different, fuller somehow. Sitting beside my husband later that evening, I realized I had been living slightly invisible, not unloved, not unhappy, just quietly absent from my own inner world. That awareness didn't bring discomfort. It brought clarity, and with it, the sense that something meaningful had begun to shift inside me. The days that followed carried a softened rhythm, as if life itself had eased its pace just enough for me to notice it again. I woke each morning feeling slightly more present, more attuned to my own thoughts and reactions. Nothing outward had changed. My husband and I moved through our routines as always, sharing meals, conversations, quiet evenings. Yet internally, I felt a gentle awareness growing, not restless or disruptive, but steady and reflective. I began paying attention to details I had long overlooked. The way sunlight shifted across the kitchen floor, the sound of birds in the early afternoon, the calm satisfaction of completing small tasks without rushing through them. I started taking longer walks, not to exercise or clear my head, but simply to exist within my own thoughts. During one of those walks, I realized that what had been stirred inside me wasn't about Mark as a person. It was about the clarity his presence had unintentionally awakened, a recognition that I had changed over the years without ever pausing to acknowledge it. I had layered responsibility upon responsibility until my own voice became background noise. One morning, while reorganizing a closet, I came across a box of old art supplies tucked away behind winter coats. The sight of it stopped me. I remembered afternoons from years ago spent painting without purpose, simply enjoying color and texture. On impulse, I opened the box and held a worn paintbrush in my hand. The familiarity made me smile. That same afternoon, I set up a small space by the window and began sketching again, not caring if the lines were imperfect. It felt grounding, like reclaiming something that had always belonged to me. A few days later, my husband casually mentioned another at-home training session. This time, my reaction wasn't nervousness or anticipation. It was curiosity. I wanted to understand this internal shift more clearly, to see where it might lead. When the day arrived, I made tea and settled in the dining room, listening to the muted rhythm of their voices as they worked. The sound felt steady, almost comforting. When the session ended, my husband stepped outside briefly, leaving Mark and me alone once more. He sat down to catch his breath, sipping water, and spoke quietly about how moments of change often arrive without drama, how clarity tends to draw us forward more than excitement ever could. His words resonated deeply, not because they suggested anything, but because they reflected exactly what I had been feeling. When my husband returned, cheerful and unaware, the moment closed naturally. Yet I knew with certainty that this quiet awakening inside me was no longer something I could ignore. It wasn't demanding action. It was asking for honesty. The days that followed felt unusually gentle, as if time itself had softened its edges. I woke each morning with a clearer sense of myself, not energized by change, but grounded by awareness. Life continued as it always had. My husband and I shared our routines, our meals, our quiet evenings, yet I moved through them with a renewed sense of presence. I noticed how often I had lived on autopilot, filling my days with responsibility while quietly setting myself aside. That realization didn't come with regret. It came with understanding. One quiet Sunday afternoon, while my husband was out running errands, I found myself sitting in the living room with an old journal resting in my hands. I hadn't opened it in years. The pages held earlier versions of me, dreams written in careful handwriting, reflections filled with curiosity and hope. Reading them stirred something tender and honest inside me. I smiled at who I had been and felt grateful for who I had become, even as I acknowledged the parts of myself I had neglected. I had just closed the journal when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Mark stood there holding a slim folder, clearly expecting to see my husband instead. He apologized for stopping by without notice and explained that he needed to drop off updated schedule notes. I invited him in, sensing that familiar steadiness in his presence. We sat across from each other in the living room, the space calm and unhurried. There was no tension, no anticipation, only a shared understanding that something meaningful had been unfolding quietly over time. He spoke thoughtfully about how people often reach stages in life where reflection becomes unavoidable, not because something is wrong, but because growth demands acknowledgement. His words mirrored my own thoughts so closely that I felt a calm certainty settle over me. When my husband returned home shortly after, the visit ended naturally. Mark left with a polite goodbye, and the house returned to its usual stillness. That evening, as I sat beside my husband, I realized the truth with clarity. This journey had never been about another person. It had been about me. About remembering myself without disrupting the life I loved. About understanding that being seen can begin from within. I didn't need change, excitement, or validation. I needed awareness and the courage to listen to my own inner voice again. As the night settled in, I felt peaceful, grounded, and quietly awake. Some awakenings don't lead us away from our lives. They lead us deeper into them, more honest, more present, and finally, fully ourselves.